Good morning. As Fabian indicated, I want to start this morning with a few words of tribute to the late Charles Kennedy, former Scottish Member of Parliament and, of course, the former leader of the UK Liberal Democrats. Charles' untimely and very sad death, of course, has been announced this morning. Charles Kennedy was one of these rare people in politics. He was an incredibly talented, gifted, effective politician. I think one of the most talented politicians of his generation. And yet somehow he also managed to be universally liked across the political spectrum and indeed across wider society. That is no mean feat. Charles will be remembered for many things. He made an outstanding and extraordinary contribution to not just Scottish but UK politics over a 30-year period. But I think he will be chiefly remembered for his principled opposition to the war in Iraq in 2003, and many of the concerns and criticisms he made then were of course subsequently found to be very well founded. And he also then, and perhaps partly because of that, went on to lead his party to its best ever election result in the 2005 general election. I have some very fond personal memories of Charles. I had the privilege of spending some time with him on a political study visit that we made together to Australia in the mid-1990s. And perhaps my fondest memory from that visit, if perhaps a slightly bizarre memory, was of the two of us skiving off one day to watch Trainspotting in a Melbourne cinema. I think we were the only two Scots in the audience at that time, so we drew some very strange looks from other people as we were uproariously laughing at lots of jokes that nobody else in the cinema were even beginning to understand. So that's a small but very special memory that I certainly will always treasure. I think the last thing to say about Charles for the moment is this. Charles Kennedy was a proud and a passionate advocate of Europe and of the UK's membership of the European Union. His would have been an incredibly powerful voice in the upcoming EU referendum. So for that reason, but also for many, many other reasons, I think our country today is much poorer for the passing of Charles Kennedy. And I'm sure I'm not the only one here today who wants to send thoughts and condolences to Charles' family, to his friends, and of course to his party colleagues. It is, Fabian, a real pleasure to be back here to speak at the European Policy Centre some 2 years after addressing the Centre before. And there's always a bit of a nerve-wracking moment when somebody quotes something you said in a speech 2 years ago as you nervously wait to see if it's something that you can still hold your head up to today. And I'm glad to say that the quote Fabian read out from that speech 2 years ago is one that I could just as easily make today. But it is a pleasure to be here. This is an organisation that for almost 2 decades has been at the forefront of discussions on the European Union, leading debate on issues such as the EU's place in the world, migration and diversity, and the promotion of economic growth. So there's no doubt whatsoever that this is an ideal audience for a speech about one of the key challenges that the EU will face over the next 2 years, namely the UK government's proposed referendum on membership. This is also an appropriate time as well as an appropriate venue at which to be making this speech. It is exactly 40 years ago this week that the UK last held a referendum on whether or not to stay in what was then the European Economic Community. And that plebiscite, which was held on the 5th of June 1975, was actually the first ever referendum held in Scotland. As you might have noticed, we've had a few other referendums since then. I should also add, just in case it's not obvious to everybody in the room, that I wasn't able to vote in 1975. I was just 4 years old at the time, actually, looking forward to starting primary school and unburdened at that time by thoughts and concerns about whether or not the UK should be a member of the EEC. But Friday's anniversary has become a very relevant one because 5 days ago, the current UK government published its draft legislation for a new referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union. And I want to talk to you today about the Scottish Government's position on that referendum. In the course of doing that, I'll set out our view that the referendum is undesirable, but I'm not going to dwell too much on that because since the referendum is now inevitable, and it is now inevitable, I think it's more important to spend my time talking about where we go from here and how the Scottish Government intends to approach the referendum in a positive and constructive manner. But I want to start with a fundamental point, and it's a point that perhaps shouldn't need said, but in the current debate it does need said. I believe unequivocally that membership of the European Union is in Scotland's best interests. I happen to believe it's in the UK's best interests as well. That's a belief I've held for all of my adult life. It's a belief shared by my party, and in fact it's a very widely held view across the entire spectrum of the Scottish Parliament. Ever since the Scottish Parliament was reconvened in 1999, it has had a European committee. The first Scottish Government established an office here in Brussels in its very first year, and the government I now lead has increased that level of engagement. In fact, 3 other Scottish Government ministers are here in Brussels this week. Rosanna Cunningham, Richard Lochhead and Aileen MacLeod will be engaged in discussions about employment, the marine environment and enhancing our natural resources. As a country of 5 million people, we understand that we can't act in isolation. Whether as part of the UK or as an independent country, we know that partnership is essential for progress. And so the fundamental vision of the EU, of independent nations working together for a common good, appeals to us. And some of the concerns which often get raised about Europe in the UK media, especially about sovereignty, possibly carry less weight in Scotland. After all, Scotland has been pooling sovereignty in one form or another for many years. We've always been a nation that has looked outwards to the rest of the UK, to Europe and to the wider world. And it's worth noting that this would have remained the case even if Scotland had voted last year to become an independent country. There's absolutely nothing contradictory about independent countries recognising their interdependence and choosing to pool some sovereignty for mutual advantage. On the contrary, that is the way of the modern world. And as part of that, I think in Scotland, most of us are essentially very comfortable with the idea of overlapping identities. We know that you can be Scottish and British, Scottish and European, Scottish and Polish, Scottish and Pakistani. And that's one of the reasons that the independence referendum last year, and this is a credit to both sides in that referendum, was such a peaceful, inclusive and democratic debate. And it's also perhaps why nobody really in that referendum argued about whether Scotland should be a member of the EU. The debate on both sides was about how best we could continue to play our part. In fact, the ability to participate more fully in international bodies such as the European Union appealed to many of us on the yes side of that debate as an additional positive reason to seek national independence. Scotland's commitment to the EU is also founded on our awareness of the practical benefits that it brings. There are many areas, whether it's climate change or energy security or international trade, where decisions taken by the EU will be more effective than decisions made by 28 individual nations. A good example is air quality. European decisions helped us to reduce sulphur dioxide emissions by almost 9/10 in the last 4 decades. And there are many other benefits. The EU has provided important social protections for workers in Scotland and across the continent. It leads research collaborations on issues like renewable energy, life sciences and sustainable planning, where Scottish universities and research institutions have much to offer. and much to learn from other world-class researchers across the continent. And of course, the single market is vital for jobs and businesses across Scotland. The European Union provides the market for almost half of our international exports. It has been estimated that those exports support more than 300,000 jobs. Ernst & Young published a survey just last week which confirmed that Scotland has become the most successful part of the UK outside of London for attracting inward investment projects. Now, much of that, of course, is due to the skills of our workforce and the quality of life that we can offer in Scotland. But for many investors, many investors, our EU membership is also a vital selling point. And perhaps most fundamentally of all, the freedom to travel, study and work across Europe has brought major benefits to Scotland. At present, there are 170,000 people from the European Union who live and work in Scotland. They contribute an enormous amount to the diversity of our culture, the prosperity of our economy and the strength of our society. So these are the reasons why I believe there is a strong and enduring attachment to membership of the European Union within Scotland, and for many of these same reasons I believe that attachment will be there for many across other parts of the UK as well. I think there are two other points that it's worth making here. The first is that alongside our openness to people from the EU, Scotland also recognises its obligations to refugees. We believe that all EU members have a role to play in helping those who have fled conflict and persecution and come to Italy or Greece from across the Mediterranean. That's why the Scottish Government has and will continue to urge the UK to participate fully in the proposed EU actions, such as on relocation and resettlement. And it's why we've made it clear that as part of that, Scotland is willing to take our fair share of refugees. And the second point is that Scotland's commitment to the EU is matched by a commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights. The Convention is one of the finest and most important achievements of the post-war era in Europe. UK politicians and UK lawyers were absolutely fundamental to its creation. In fact, much of the Convention was drafted by David Maxwell Fyfe, a Scottish lawyer and a Conservative politician. I think it defies belief that any government would even consider trying to distance the UK from the Convention. And I want to make it clear today that the Scottish Government's belief in European cooperation includes a firm belief in the principles of the ECHR. Our opposition to any proposals which weaken its protections will be robust and unequivocal. However, the focus of my speech today is on the European Union, not on the European Convention. And it's maybe not surprising, given what I've just said, that polls in Scotland consistently show strong support for EU membership, although there is no room for complacency and we should take nothing for granted. But in last month's general election, less than 2% of the Scottish population voted for parties that want to exit the European Union. Euroscepticism exists in Scotland, of course it does, but in my view not to a great extent and not with the same virulence that we sometimes see in some other parts of the UK. That's why the Scottish Government, as I articulated 2 years ago, did not support a referendum on EU membership. I don't think it's a priority for most people in Scotland. However, we do understand and accept that the result of the UK election makes that referendum inevitable. And so I want to concentrate this morning on how the Scottish Government can make a positive contribution to the process. And I want to highlight 3 areas in particular where we will seek to make a difference. Firstly, on the content of the referendum legislation. Secondly, on our proposals for European reform. And thirdly, around the overwhelmingly positive case that we will make in the run-up to the referendum for continued UK membership. If we start with the legislation, last year the Scottish Government organised the referendum on independence, which I think was recognised around the world as a model of peaceful, impassioned democratic engagement. The country, in the run-up to the vote in September last year, was alive with discussion and debate in the workplace, at home, in cafes and pubs, and on the streets of Scotland. Across the country, people were energised and enthused by politics in a way that has never happened before, certainly not in my lifetime. And those effects have largely lasted. There's been a surge in membership of some political parties. Turnout in Scotland at the general election last month was 5% higher than turnout in the rest of the UK. People understand much better than they did before the referendum that their opinion matters, their voice can be heard, and that their vote can help to shape the country that they live in. Now, all of that said, I'm not going to stand here and argue that the EU referendum will have identical consequences to that, although it is immensely important to Scotland, to the UK and to Europe. It's maybe not going to arouse exactly the same intensity of feeling as the referendum on Scottish independence did. But nevertheless, it is surely essential that the referendum bill draws on some of the unquestioned successes of Scotland's experience. And the most obvious of those is the franchise, the voting age. Although in UK elections you have to be over 18 to vote, in Scotland we allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in the referendum and will do so for future Scottish Parliament elections. And in the referendum, 16 and 17-year-olds, although there was a lot of scepticism at the outset about whether this would turn out to be the case, but they proved themselves to be the mature, thoughtful, concerned citizens that we always thought they would be. I think the case for letting 16 and 17-year-olds vote in the EU referendum is overwhelming. A second example is citizenship. I mentioned earlier that there are 170,000 EU citizens from outside the UK who live in Scotland. They can vote in Scottish parliamentary and local government elections, and they were also able to vote in the independence referendum. And that decision was actually completely uncontroversial at the time of the referendum. All parties in the Scottish Parliament approved of it. It seemed to us like basic common sense. We're proud that people choose to make Scotland their home, and so we believe that anyone who makes that choice, regardless of where they were born, should have a voice on the issues that affect our country. So it's incomprehensible, in my view, that for the EU referendum, the UK government is proposing to grant the right to vote to citizens of 3 other EU countries, Ireland, Malta and Cyprus, but not to the remaining 24, denying them a say on an issue which affects them so directly is unfair, it's undemocratic and it is unjustifiable. I have a party colleague who's a member of the Scottish Parliament. He was born in France. He's a French citizen, he's a member of the Scottish Parliament and makes an enormous contribution to life and political discourse in Scotland, and yet he, with many thousands of others, will be denied a vote in the European referendum. I think that's wrong, and the SNP, during the passage of the legislation, will seek to change that. And there's one final argument we'll make about the referendum bill, one of the things that Fabian mentioned in his introduction. During the independence referendum last year, Scotland was consistently told that we're a valued and equal partner in a UK family of nations. And remember, the UK is just that, a multinational state. Surely, therefore, none of the nations that make up the UK should be at risk of being forced out of the EU against their will. So that's why we're arguing for a double majority provision where the UK can only leave the EU if each nation of the UK votes to leave. That sort of territorial requirement is, of course, already used in some federal states like Canada or Australia. I think it's time to apply it to the UK for this referendum as well. The equal status of England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales should be reflected in the reality of legislation, not just in the rhetoric of campaigning. So those are the changes we will seek to make to the referendum bill as it makes its way through the House of Commons. But the second thing the Scottish Government will do, in addition to making these proposals, is contribute positively to discussions on the reform of the European Union. President Juncker said in Strasbourg last July that Europe needs a broad-based agenda for reform. Many member states endorse that view. I endorse that view. Sensible proposals for change do stand a real chance of commanding acceptance. The Scottish Government is already contributing to this wider debate. Fiona Hislop spoke to the European Policy Centre in October about our approach. We believe that reforms can be implemented within the existing treaty framework rather than requiring treaty change. And we believe that reforms should address two key priorities. The first is relatively straightforward. The EU should focus on economic and social policies which will make a tangible difference to the lives of its citizens. In some areas, that means that the EU should allow member states more autonomy to tackle pressing problems. Public health is a relevant example, not just for Scotland, but for many countries. Some years ago, the Scottish Parliament voted to introduce minimum pricing for alcohol to tackle alcohol harm in our society. Now, this is currently being considered by the Scottish courts and the Court of Justice of the European Union, and on this issue, it is now entirely a matter for the judgment of the courts. But more generally, and looking more to the future, we all recognise that the human, social and economic costs of alcohol harm demand really substantive action. So too do the harms associated with tobacco and poor diet. My view is that EU policy should recognise that. They should give a higher priority to enabling member states to take the decisions they deem necessary to protect life and promote health. And as it gives member states more flexibility in some areas, such as public health, the EU should focus its efforts instead on where international cooperation can make the biggest difference. For example, the EU should complete the single market in services. It should also work to deliver President Juncker's priority of a digital single market, giving companies across Europe an equal opportunity to sell digital goods and services and giving customers the ability to buy and then use digital content across national borders. The reduction of roaming charges is a good example of tangible European action which will benefit consumers right across the continent. And I think further steps like that will remind the public of the direct benefits that the EU can create and deliver. Energy is another very good example. An integrated EU energy market would benefit consumers and provide greater security of supply. Better interconnections, including progress towards a North Sea grid, would help renewable energy to play an even greater role in meeting our energy needs. And this is an area where international action led by the EU could benefit consumers, encourage economic growth and reduce carbon emissions. The Scottish Government's second priority here is regulatory reform. To give an example of this, Scotland has contributed to the reforms that were agreed recently to the Common Fisheries Policy. They involve changes to allow more decisions to be made at a regional rather than an EU level, something which will help to make regulations more proportionate and less burdensome for industry. It's in keeping with the approach we want to see adopted more widely. Regulations should be based on the principles of proportionality and subsidiarity. Better regulation will contribute to economic growth, and by doing so, it can also help to restore public trust in the decisions made by European institutions. Now, at this precise moment in time, it is, of course, difficult to know, as the UK still considers its negotiating stance, to what extent our proposals match the UK government's. Although it is now 29 months since the Prime Minister announced his intention to negotiate reforms, we still have very little idea of the specific changes that he wants to see. Some UK government ideas might match our agenda, others might not. For example, we value the contribution that EU migrants make to our economy and society, as well, of course, as the reciprocal freedom we have to travel to other EU countries. And so, while there may be a case for some collective reform of the rules underpinning freedom of movement to guard against abuse, we do not want to lose the benefits that it brings. But where there is overlap between the UK government's ideas and our own, we will work constructively, if we can, with Westminster. It is in all of our interests to create a better EU, and it's in all of our interests for the whole of the UK to stay in the European Union. However, there are two dangers in the current UK position that I do want to flag up. The first relates to the negotiations. I've said already that there's a wide consensus that reforms to the EU are desirable. So we shouldn't cast negotiations in terms of there being winners and losers. The whole point about a more effective European Union is that everybody should gain from it. Compromise isn't always the same as concession. And there's a further point. Some UK government rhetoric creates the impression that EU membership isn't beneficial at present, that it will only become beneficial if we achieve big enough reforms. And that approach makes it much harder to articulate the benefits we gain now from membership. And there's a danger that the UK will focus the debate on the size of the reforms achieved rather than the bigger picture of the value and importance of the EU. I'd like to see a much more positive perspective from the UK government. If the UK government wants us to remain in the EU, it should give people something to vote for. Instead of just arguing against the risks of change, it should promote the EU's achievements. If it fails to do that, then even if it wins the vote, it might not resolve the issue. And there are big lessons there to be learnt from the Scottish independence referendum. So the Scottish Government is approaching the referendum from a rather different perspective. We see the European Union as a positive force in Scotland and in the UK as a whole. And so throughout the coming months and years, however long it is until the day of polling, we will make an overwhelmingly positive case for Europe. It will be based on practical benefits, our trade, the jobs it helps to secure, the extent to which we all benefit from the right to live, study, travel and trade across 28 countries. But it will also be based in part on who we are, the sort of country that we want Scotland to be. When President Barroso accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the EU back in 2012, he said that over the last 60 years, the European project has shown that it is possible for people and nations to come together across borders, that it is possible to overcome the differences between them and us. We endorse that view and that vision. We like working with our friends and neighbours from across the continent, and that wouldn't have changed if Scotland had become independent. We believe that the EU's achievements are far more significant than its shortcomings. We want to work to improve it, but we do not want to leave it. Scotland has much to offer the EU, but we also have much to learn. The example of some of the smaller member states, many of them, of course, only having taken their place in the European family in recent years, often within a few short years of gaining their independence, shows that valued national sovereignty can be retained while countries also work together for the common good. I've already mentioned on a number of occasions Scotland's own referendum last year. You know, that was truly the most extraordinary flowering of democracy and an invigorating, empowering experience for all of us who took part in it. And while it didn't produce the result that I so passionately advocated, the examples of those smaller members of the EU I spoke of a moment ago offer a pointer to how Scotland might contribute to Europe in years to come. To do so, of course, we must be part of the European Union. I've previously stated my view that if Scotland were to be taken out of Europe, despite voting as a nation to have remained, it would provoke a strong backlash amongst many ordinary voters in Scotland. Quite what the result of that would be, no one can foresee. But I stated before that this could be one scenario producing the kind of material change in circumstances that would precipitate popular demand for a second independence referendum. Bluntly, I believe that the groundswell of anger amongst many ordinary people in Scotland in these circumstances could produce a clamour for another independence referendum that may well be unstoppable. Of course, it is open to the UK government to stop that happening, to guard against that scenario by agreeing to the double majority provision that I referred to earlier on. Now, I began this speech by referring back to the 1975 referendum on EEC membership, and that's where I'll close this speech as well. Roy Jenkins, who of course subsequently became president of the Commission here in Brussels, once wrote about his experience of that referendum campaign. He said that it was always the high arguments, the broad discussion of the country's future orientation in both foreign policy and economic terms that most captured the attention and fired the imagination of audiences. Now, Roy Jenkins' experience of 1975 may, of course, have been slightly idealised, but it would be nice to think that at least some of the debate, I hope lots of the debate over the next 2 years, could mirror his memories and indeed mirror Scotland's experience over the past couple of years, there is a chance to lead and to listen to a public debate on the future direction of Scotland, the UK, and indeed of Europe. All politicians should approach that opportunity as openly and as positively as we possibly can. Because if we do so, we are more likely to make our case in a way that does capture people's attention and imagination and earns their respect. The outcome of the referendum, if that happens, is then more likely to be decisive, and then we will be even better placed to contribute positively, constructively and influentially to the European Union in the years and decades ahead.